Good evening for Telesur. I'm Cody Weddle in Caracas, Venezuela. Groups continue with their environmental demands in Peru. Less than a week before the climate change conference, the COP20 begins there soon. For more on their demands, here's our correspondent Rael Mora.
After 3 years of attempting to meet with the government, indigenous leaders from the Peruvian Amazon denounced a new delay with no date given.
We are Amazon indigenous people who have suffered more than 40 years of oil exploitation, in which the state has permitted the violation of all of our rights in this area.
Congresswoman Veronica Mendoza knows that the issue has been ignored by the current administration for 3 years, and attention to it should be paid now that Peru is hosting the 20th United Nations Environmental Conference.
The petroleum exploitation has, apart from generating large profits, left behind a serious problem of environmental contamination. Continuous spills have affected lakes and rivers and consequently threatened the health and the life of the indigenous populations of the area.
Congresswoman Mendoza also suggests that the government's indefinite delay in meeting with its representatives from the Amazon is an attempt to circumvent the law requiring indigenous consultation and thus extend the oil exploitation in the area. Reporting for Lima, Peru for Telesur, Rael Mora.
Thanks to Rael. Now in Bolivia, where the G77 summit is starting, Bolivian President Evo Morales inaugurated the G77 plus China summit today in the city of Tarija. This weekend, the 78 nations will analyze economic development and the management of natural resources. Morales calls the nationalization of natural resources a political demand of social movements. Morales also added that the Bolivian economy continues to grow despite what he called misconceptions that nationalization detracts from investment. Brazilian President Dilma Rousseff has named pro-market bank executive Joaquim Levy as her new finance minister. Levy was a popular choice in the financial world and previously worked as the chief executive officer of Brazil's second largest private bank. He also worked with the International Monetary Fund and the European Central Bank. Rousseff's government is hoping to steer the economy out of recession. She had become deeply unpopular with the business community because of social policies favoring the poor. To the United States now. That's where people around the country are protesting and continuing with their call for a boycott of what they have named Black Lives Matter Friday. For more on their demands, here's our correspondent Alexandra Hall.
Riding the wave of a series of mass protests all around the country in response to a grand jury's decision not to indict Officer Darren Wilson for the fatal shooting of Michael Brown, activists all around the country are staging acts of civil disobedience in commercial centers to boycott Black Friday, or as they've renamed it, Black Lives Matter Friday. It kicked off this Friday in St. Louis at the Galleria Mall, where hundreds of protesters entered the shopping center, staged a die-in, and shouted through the halls, "Stop shopping, join the revolution." They vowed to shut it down, and it looks like they actually did that because shop owners actually closed their stores and the mall was closed at least momentarily. They're telling us right now that the reason for boycotting Black Friday is to say that you can exercise your civil rights in a number of ways. You can protest, you can vote, but you can also decide where you spend and where you don't spend your money, and that can be very powerful. We're expecting other protests not only here in Ferguson and St. Louis but throughout the country, and we'll have more on that as the information comes in. In St. Louis, I'm Alexandra Hall for Telesur.
Thanks to Alexandra. To the continent of Africa now. While Liberia continues to fight against Ebola, medical authorities ask that those helping remain on high alert. They call it necessary to avoid new outbreaks that would complicate the situation. With more on their plans, here's our correspondent Oscar Elpelde.
When someone dies at home, a burial team comes. Now, they don't have as much work as in September. They come to take the body and ensure a secure burial. The person that neighbor cried for yesterday had been sick for 2 months, so it's not very likely that they died of Ebola, and they have finally been buried near the house. As time goes on, one hears fewer ambulance sirens. Now there are Ebola treatment centers with available beds that do not have to turn patients away like they did in September. The response to Ebola has strengthened and the epidemic has been curbed in a large part to the community initiatives. The Unity community in Montserrato has been one of the communities hardest hit by Ebola, and the effects would have been much worse if it were not for the community that was organized to collect contributions of food and money to maintain the quarantine on affected families. Families like this, the Ayman died, while two of his women, his children, his nephew, and various children became ill. These are the ones that survived. After the hospital, they returned to their home that had previously been disinfected. Other neighbors suffered the same helplessness as well. The mother of this sick girl went to her village in search of refuge, and afterwards 21 relatives and friends died. They became sick here in her house in Unity as well. 2 children were taken to the hospital and their father has not been heard from.
Since the 16th and 17th of September, they took them to the hospital. Up to today's date, I don't hear about them at all.
Like the Zombo family, the Mazzali family has only been able to rely on the help of the community that organized to help neighbors. From Montserrat, Oscar Epele for Telesur.
Thanks to Oscar. Moving east to Egypt, that's where at least 3 people have been killed and dozens wounded in a wave of protests. Protesters are demanding the ousting of President Abdel Fattah Sisi. Sisi led a coup against Egypt's first democratically elected leader last year before going on to win a controversial presidential election. Today's protests were smaller than those that shook Egypt in the wake of the coup. Still, the demonstrations were targeted by a massive police crackdown. And voters in the southern African nation of Namibia went to the polls today in the country's parliamentary and presidential elections. Just over 1 million Namibians are estimated to have cast a vote. The ruling SWAPO party is widely expected to hold the parliament. SWAPO has been in power for more than 2 decades and has presided over a resource boom that has made Namibia one of the most stable countries in sub-Saharan Africa. That's despite stubbornly high rates of poverty and inequality. At least 30 people were injured when a supercell storm battled Australia's 3rd largest city of Brisbane. That's a kind of severe rotating thunderstorm as strong as a cyclone. Powerful winds and tennis ball-sized hailstones have inflicted more than $100 million in damages to infrastructure and private property in the city. The storm is already being hailed as the worst to hit the city in 30 years. We end tonight with a political ballet. The life of late Venezuelan President Hugo Chavez was the subject of a ballet yesterday here in Caracas, with hundreds of people gathering to witness From Sweet Seller to Liberator. That's the title. The ballet chronicles Chavez's life as a boy selling homemade sweets in his rural hometown. From that to leader of the Latin American nation, it features more than 40 dancers. Plenty more on those stories and others at our website, telesurtv.net/English. For Telesur English, I'm Cody Weddle. Have a great weekend.